This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hi everyone, I'm Hone, and it's Wednesday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. The series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. One of my goals with this series is ultimately to look at every single Magic set ever. I've already done about 10 of them, and today we're continuing with that theme by looking at the Dark, which is often considered one of Magic's worst sets ever in terms of power level. The Dark came out in 1994, and it was only Magic's fourth set after Alpha. I think it's pretty interesting to look at sets that are considered bad with these lists. I've already done Homelands and Fallen Empires, for example, and well, the Dark does live up to this reputation for the most part. There are 122 cards in the Dark, and there are only 11 that have points using my scoring system, so I was only just barely able to fill out this top 10. That's worse than both Fallen Empires and Homeland did in terms of cards that have points. In addition to that, the Dark has several cards that make most lists for worst cards ever, like Sorrow's Path and Eternal Flame. Still, bad set or not, the Dark has certainly had an impact on competitive Magic, and it still has one up to this very day. Before we get started with this list, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A top 10 at a Pro Tour, Players Tour, Mythic Championship, Mythic Invitational, Legacy, or Vintage Championship is worth 2 points, and a top 8 at a Magic Fest or Grand Prix is worth 1 point. At number 10, it's Safe Haven, which is an interesting little land. First of all, like a lot of non-basics in Magic's early days, it doesn't actually produce mana. That's a pretty big deal, as spending a land drop on something that doesn't produce mana is pretty brutal sometimes. Safe Haven does come with a pretty interesting effect, and it's also one that is quite flavorful. It lets you exile your own creatures, effectively protecting them in this Safe Haven, and then on your upkeep every turn you can choose to get rid of Safe Haven and get all those creatures back. This certainly has some potentially interesting uses, like abusing Enter the Battlefield abilities and the like. It gained its one Pro Tour top 8 at Pro Tour New York in 1996, where it was a sideboard card in a mono-black aggro deck. The plan was to bring in the Haven against people who were playing board sweepers. As long as the Haven was in play and you had 2 mana up, you could protect your best creature, which was usually something like Hypnotic Spectre. Despite being a time-shifted card that became legal in Standard again, not to mention Extended and Modern, Safe Haven hasn't gained any points since that one Pro Tour top 8 in 1996. At number 9, it's Holy Light. It actually has the same score as Safe Haven, but I gave it the edge because it's also played a lot in Pauper, and that seemed like a reasonable tiebreaker. This instant hoses all non-white creatures, giving them -1/-1 until end of turn. That kind of effect can be particularly potent against decks reliant on X1s. Holy Light didn't actually see any play at all in Magic's early days. It didn't gain a single point until just a few years ago in 2018, when it found its way into the sideboard of a Life from the Loam deck in Legacy. The Legacy metagame at that point was inundated with powerful X1 creatures like True Name Nemesis, Young Pyromancer, and Gravecrawler. Holy Light was especially nice against True Name Nemesis because there are so few things that can kill it. Holy Light hasn't gained any points since 2018, but if the metagame is just right, maybe it will gain a few more points in the future. At number 8, it is Ashes to Ashes. For 3 mana, this can get rid of 2 non-artifact creatures. That's a pretty great rate for a 2-for-1. The downside is that you have to pay 5 life to do it, but that's often well worth it. In Standard, Ashes to Ashes gained its one top 8 in a mono-black aggro deck, the same deck that featured Safe Haven in the sideboard. Then in 2001, it was featured in an extended mono-black Reanimator deck. It hasn't gained any points since 2001, though. At number 7, it is Elves of Deep Shadow. Like most mana elves, this is a 1-mana 1/1 that can tap for mana. In this case, the Elves of Deep Shadow tap for black mana and do 1 damage to you. That damage is often worth it though, as being able to play your 3-drop on turn 2 is great. Interestingly, Elves of Deep Shadow did not gain any points as a result of its original printing in the Dark, which is a little surprising. You'd think people would find space for a mana elf. However, the Elves did get a reprint in a set released about a decade later, Ravnica, City of Guilds. It's gained all of its points as a result of that reprint. In Standard, it gained points in a Bug mid-range deck, and in Modern and Extended, its points have come in Elf tribal decks. It has gained points in Modern as recently as 2018, and Elf decks aren't completely out of the picture in either Legacy or Modern, so there is some potential here for the score to go up. At number 6, it is Fountain of Youth, a 0-mana artifact that can gain you 1 life if you pay 2 mana and tap it. That's not so great, even at 0 mana, and isn't the kind of card that you would see play today if it was reprinted, and in fact it was reprinted in 10th edition, and it didn't do anything as a result of that printing. Sure, it's free to play, but gaining life with it is pretty costly, and you use up a card for a pretty minimal effect. However, it was featured in 3 of the top 8 decks at Pro Tour New York in 1996. This was partly the result of the weird rules in place at that Pro Tour. While it was and is considered a standard event, the Pro Tour had some weird deck building requirements. Namely, players had to have at least 5 cards from each expansion that was out at the time in their 75 cards. And because the Dark wasn't a great set, finding something to include wasn't particularly easy for players, although, as we'll see, there were assuredly some better options than Fountain of Youth. At any rate, control decks used the Fountain, with some decks even putting it in the main deck. The plan was to utilize the life gain to make the game go long in their favor. Obviously enough, Fountain of Youth has exactly 0 points since 1996. At number 5, it is Felwar Stone. The stone is a 2-mana mana rock, and that's pretty great. Even if it is restricted to only producing mana your opponent can produce. Felwar Stone gained its first top 8 at Worlds in 1995 in a control deck. 1996 was a more active year, largely as a result of Pro Tour New York. It was featured in 4 of the top 8 decks at that event, often played alongside a copy or 2 of Fountain of Youth to meet the 5 cards from the Dark requirement. Felwar Stone was later reprinted in 9th edition, and it managed another top 8 in the Standard of 2005, where it appeared in an Enduring Ideal deck. That deck's entire goal was to get to 7 mana as fast as possible, and then utilize the powerful Epic spell to cheat all kinds of enchantments into play on subsequent turns, and obviously Felwar Stone helped you get to that 7 a little faster. At number 4, it is Ball Lightning, one of the most aggressive creatures in Magic's earlier days. Ball Lightning often lets you pay 3 mana to do 6 to your opponent, and that's a pretty good rate for aggro decks. The bad news for Ball Lightning is that it had a difficult mana cost, and the traditional mono-red aggro deck we're so familiar with today didn't really materialize until the late 1990s, when the deck received some more tools. But when those decks did emerge at Worlds in 1998, Ball Lightning was a huge part of what made them successful. It would go on to find success in extended mono-red aggro, and it even gained another Pro Tour top 8 in Standard as a result of a reprint in Magic 2010. It's pretty unlikely Ball Lightning gains points going forward. It just isn't good enough for aggro decks and non-rotating formats these days. However, it would be pretty interesting to see if it has any success in a Standard legal reprint. At number 3, I have Maze of Ith, another land that doesn't produce mana, but it does come with a pretty powerful ability. You can use it on your own creatures to save them from a block that isn't advantageous, and you can also use it on an opposing creature to make it so that it won't be damaging you. It was played in the early days of the game and even got restricted in 1994, meaning you could only play a single copy of it in your deck. It would also later be banned and extended. The maze frequently made games long and uninteresting, and it was restricted in large part because of that, and not just because of how good it was. The maze has found the most success in Legacy Lands, which, as you can probably guess from the name, is a deck with a lot of lands in it. It runs various cards that let you tutor up whatever land you want, and Maze of Ith is generally a singleton card in that deck, since sometimes it's pretty critical to find it. It's going to continue to gain points in Legacy going forward, but the 2 cards in front of it have a huge lead and are still active, so it's fairly likely it will never move beyond the number 3 spot on this list. At number 2, it is Blood Moon, one of the most maligned cards around. Blood Moon really punishes people for relying too heavily on non-basic lands since it turns them all into mountains. This can hurt your opponent by taking away all the mana and the colors they need, or by shutting down powerful non-basic lands, or by doing both at the same time. Blood Moon has been played as a sideboard card in every format it's ever been legal in, and it's even been heavily featured in the main deck of decks in both Modern and Legacy. In those formats, Blood Moon really hoses most of the metagame, so aggressive strategies like mono-red aggro tend to feature it, as do Blue Moon decks, whose entire strategy is built around getting Blood Moon in play. In Legacy, its most frequent main deck home is Dragon Stompy, a prison deck that tends to tamper with every aspect of the opponent's game, including their mana, and that's where Blood Moon comes in. Blood Moon is going to continue to gain more points in Modern and Legacy going forward, but it's unclear whether it will ever catch the number 1 card on this list, which is Torments Crypt. While it was originally printed in the Dark, it has been reprinted a ton, helping it to its absolutely massive score. The Crypt costs 0 mana, which is a heck of a deal since it can exile an entire graveyard from the game. You can of course leave it in play with the plan to use it in response to an opponent trying to do stuff with their graveyard, which tends to be the most powerful thing to do with this, but you can also just get rid of a graveyard right away if you need to. It didn't see any play in Standard as a result of its first printing way back in the Dark, but this is largely because there wasn't really a super graveyard-heavy deck in existence at the time that wouldn't really happen until 1998. However, a subsequent reprint in Magic 2013 and 2015 gave it some more time in Standard, and it put up all of its points in that format between 2012 and 2015. It still didn't do a whole lot there. There just weren't enough reasons to be running the Crypt for it to be a consistent performer. More recently, it received a reprint in Core Set 2021, and while it hasn't gained any points in Standard as a result, it has been featured in Pioneer sideboards. In formats with larger card pools and far more powerful graveyard decks like Dredge, Storm, and Reanimator, Torments Crypt has been an indispensable sideboard card for a very long time. So, yeah, the Dark may be kind of a bad set overall, but both Blood Moon and Torments Crypt are crucial cards in Magic to this very day. Well, those are the 10 cards from the Dark that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. If you're interested in owning any of these cards, you can buy them at Card Kingdom. In the description, you'll find a direct link to the Card Kingdom store for every single card in this video. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to get caught up on more of my MTG Top 10s, including more that look at specific sets, you should see some playlists on your screen now. Lastly, if you enjoy my Magic content, please consider subscribing to my other channel, Need to Hone History, where I talk about real-world history. Thanks for watching.